Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of our Welty at Home reading of The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. I'm Lauren Rhodes. I'm the director of Theodora Welty House, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Suzanne Mars, who will introduce our facilitator today.
This is a happy duty opportunity. Today, we are honored to welcome Professor Jay Watson for the first of his 4 sessions with our book club. Jay is Howard Professor of Faulkner Studies and Professor of English at the University of Mississippi, where each year he directs the Faulkner and Yoknapatawpha Conference and edits the proceedings for the distinguished book series bearing the conference's name. An award-winning teacher as well as an editor, Jay is perhaps best known nationally and internationally as the author of 3 important critically acclaimed books about Faulkner: Forensic Fictions, The Lawyer Figure in Faulkner, Reading for the Body, The Recalcitrant Materiality of Southern Fiction, and most recently, this book, which is titled Faulkner and the Faces of Modernity. I learned only this morning, thanks to Sarah Ford, that Faulkner and the Faces of Modernity has won the 2020 C. Hugh Holman Award for the year's best book of literary scholarship or literary criticism in the field of Southern literature. Clearly, we are very fortunate to have this eminent editor, teacher, and scholar leading our discussion today. So I'm going to shut up and turn this over to Jay. Welcome, Jay.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. I should flip the script here and say that I'm honored to join this group. Lauren and Suzanne have already given me a sense of what a lively group it is, and the great discussions that y'all have already started, carrying forward from last week. So I do hope to very quickly just kind of like get out of the way and maybe see if I can be a useful resource. Or help you with the discussions that you've already got going on and that you're clearly interested in having among yourselves. So I'm going to start off just by saying a few words that'll hook in to, I believe, an observation Suzanne made last week when she was giving you all a brief introduction to the novel, and that was that Faulkner turned to The Sound and the Fury in the disappointment of having his previous novel, Flags in the Dust, turned down by his publisher. It was really, really unexpected. Faulkner thought he had just written this bang-up novel, going to be like the best novel that his publisher saw all year, and was absolutely floored, blindsided by the publisher's rejection of the novel. But strangely enough, that turned into a freeing thing for him. And he would go on to say that The Sound and the Fury was a book that he wrote for himself. It was as if in his own mind, he had closed a door between himself and his publishers or the reading public. And so I find it really suggestive that in this next thing that he wrote, he created these narrators like Benji Compson, who have absolutely no sense of accountability to the reader, to providing the reader the most basic kind of details of exposition or telling you who a character is the first time that they kind of wander onto the stage. So it's almost like Faulkner is writing that intense kind of privacy and freedom into the lives of his narrators. And you'll see that the other narrators that you're going to meet in the coming weeks are a good bit like that as well. When Faulkner started writing for himself, what I really admire about what he did was the risk-taking. He just began to take risks with his work that he had not allowed himself to take in earlier novels. And I just want to describe one of those risks today with a little bit of help from another scholar. I think in The Sound and the Fury, Faulkner begins to excavate a territory that he was just beginning to discover and to kind of think his way into for himself. We tend to talk about Faulkner in terms of creating this literary territory called Yoknapatawpha County, this fictional place in North Mississippi that has a lot in common with Oxford, but that's actually not the territory that I'm talking about here. This is a more kind of interior territory that he begins to map in The Sound and the Fury. And I've had a lot of help thinking about this different kind of Faulkner country. I sometimes describe it as Faulkner country to my students. I've gotten a lot of help from my fellow scholar, Philip Weinstein, who wrote a wonderful book about a decade ago called Becoming Faulkner. And in that book, he makes the basic argument that Faulkner was very, very interested in the human mind and human perception and human knowledge. And what his most fundamental insight into that was, is that for human beings and human awareness, our experience always precedes our understanding. It runs out in front of our ability to make sense of what we know. Often, we don't tend to experience that gap very often in our daily lives, because usually the sense-making resources that we carry around with us, our sense of events is linked in time, the words we use to describe our experiences, the stories that we use to give shape to them. Usually these resources that we draw on are up to the task of making sense of our experience and shaping it into something meaningful for ourselves. But there are other times, there are moments of crisis or of great intensity in our lives where sometimes our ability to make sense of our experience is lagging behind the moment and the event. And so we come closer to actually experiencing the raw flux, the kind of turbulent storm and the riot of stimuli and sensations that are actually pouring down on us all the time. But we've been habituated to our ability to shape that into meaningful patterns. What Weinstein says about Faulkner is that Faulkner, more than any other writer of the 20th century, is actually the writer of this gap between our experience and our understanding. That Faulkner goes into that gap, he goes deeply into it, he finds techniques, he finds ways to actually widen that gap in his fiction and draw out the distance and the time lag between experiencing something and understanding what we've experienced. And the very first experiment he performed for himself in staking out this new territory was to create Benji Compson as the narrator of The Sound and the Fury. And by disabling this character, and I'm thinking about his mental impairment here, and kind of, keeping him frozen at a mental age that one of the other characters describes as about 3 years old. It's Benji's 33rd birthday, but it's like he's been 3 years old for 30 years. Faulkner's introducing us to a consciousness that doesn't quite have the tools yet in order to make sense of the storm of experience that's going on around him as his family confronts conflicts and as his family moves on into the 20th century. So part of the risk-taking and the experimentalism that you see in the first section of The Sound and the Fury is Faulkner's way of improvising subject matter and improvising literary strategies that can take him into that intense, unusual, kind of underrepresented zone where experience is still swirling around us and it hasn't quite congealed into understanding. So that's kind of my preface. I think that might give you a context for understanding some of the radical, maybe sometimes some of the off-putting things that Faulkner's doing with his technique in The Sound and the Fury, and then also why he begins that novel. I mean, beyond the nice tie-in to the title from the Shakespeare quotation in Macbeth, where we're told that life is a tale told by an idiot. So besides that nice thematic tie-in, maybe we have some deeper insight into why Faulkner felt drawn to a character, to an impaired character like Benji, for his first real deep dive down into the literary depiction of consciousness and the human interior. That's probably enough talking. I hope it doesn't shut the room up, but I'm just really interested in your thoughts with the stage set. I'm really interested in your thoughts on the novel, and we'll look forward to listening in and maybe chipping in every now and then.
And just a reminder, you can use the reaction button to raise your hand. You can also post in the chat, or you can just go ahead and unmute and speak up.
I'm waiting for, I know somebody here has a question.
I'll buy a little time by saying one of the things I often do when I teach this novel is for our first meeting with students, I really encourage the students to kind of lean in to the sense of disorientation or the sense of frustration they may feel in reading the text, because those are the most acute moments in which Faulkner is really trying to make us feel what it's like to be Benji, what Benji feels. And he's trying to make his novel do what it's talking about to the reader.
Suzanne, I have a question.
Oh, okay, Holmes and then Alec. Okay.
The first section is so confusing, but it's complete. How long did it take him to write this? Was this a quickly done novel, or did it take a long time to write?
I think Faulkner drafted this whole thing in under a year. So the first section would have been a matter of weeks or months in getting it drafted. There was heavy revision, but I think that he moved fairly quickly through the material, and with a real sense of joy and discovery and excitement in the process.
Alec?
I was just going to say that I'll pose it as a question. I wonder why Faulkner created a novel and a world here where it seems that nothing works in the lives of the characters. And I can't help explaining, comparing it to existentialism, where God had disappeared and there were just no answers. And I know I'm not the only one there to compare Faulkner to that, but one of the most important things in life, really, to most people, is to have a family and have children who will at least be a comfort to their parents, and if not, contribute something to the world. Well, all of these children do an awful job at that. Jason is, thinks about making money, but he's awful at making money, or even just being a decent person in the community. Quentin, they're going to send to Harvard, and I guess if he could have gotten there and could have graduated, he could have made something of himself. But they sell a piece of land to, for that, and that's a complete bust. And poor Caddy, just she tries to boss everyone else around when she's a little girl, but she does a terrible job of making anything worthwhile of her own life, and so on. So I was just going to pose that as a question. I wonder why Faulkner, if indeed he did have a sort of existentialist outlook, what is man going to do without God and without purpose? It seems he chose to cast that in a family that is so dysfunctional. That's all.
Jay, you want to comment on that?
Well, maybe just as a beginning of a response, I think that one of the things that human beings, can do when their world seems broken or when they don't seem to have the answers, I think that's just another way of describing what I was describing about this feeling of being unprepared for the reality that you find yourself in. One of the things that human beings can do is adapt and change and embrace the kind of change and the unknowability of the world, in some ways as a challenge or as an adventure. And I think that's what Caddy is good at. That's the energy that I take away with me when I think about Caddy and about why she's such a special character in the eyes of all of her brothers and in the eyes of her creator. And I think you see that from that earliest scene that Benji remembers. Though remembers is probably a little bit of a misnomer. Benji just seems to relive things that happened in his deep past. But that scene where, Caddy is the one who's brave enough and curious enough and adventure enough to go into the creek and splash around, right, on that night where all of the children are so, they're so confused and down about the death of their grandmother. And, Caddy is the one who, in a sense, she gets her hands dirty and her feet wet with life, without necessarily being guaranteed any answers, right? Or any kind of, any happy endings.
I think it's Jackie is next, I think. But unless Megan, you disappeared on me. Did you want to?
I was just going to ask another kind of nuts and bolts question, so I didn't want to disrupt the discussion about characters. I was just going to ask really quickly, since this was a book written in a more experimental way and with less care for a sort of, success quotient, how did it come about being published? What was that process like? But that is something we could return to. I didn't want to interrupt the discussion of characters. Yeah.
The one quick thing I'll say about that is Faulkner had a new publisher for this novel. So, his former publisher had disappointed him. And so he began working with a man named Harrison Smith, who just kind of had a feel for what Faulkner was doing and worked with him to publish some of his boldest and most experimental novels over the next 5 or 6 years.
I know that story of Harrison Smith is a great story. Has someone written that story? Is there a book about Harrison Smith?
If there's a biography, I'm not aware of it, but you're right. That would be a great, really fascinating book to read. If you can just imagine what it must have been like in 1928 to have this manuscript come to you through the mail and kind of read it and get it and want to support it, when it was going to really turn the literary world upside down. I mean, a lot of credit needs to go to Faulkner's publisher for that book seeing the light of day at all.
Yeah. All right, Jackie.
I was just wondering if we could, you touched on it about time. And I know that last week we had a number of first-time readers who, were talking about how difficult it was. And I think that's a big element of what's going on here is that they jump around in time, or Benji jumps around in time so much. I mean, of course, that reflects the way you experience memories or reliving, like you thought. It's not linear, it's not chronological. But maybe talk about a little bit more of what Faulkner maybe intended with that, or how it brings along the narrative.
Well, this was a very modern idea about time, that in a way we live time much more subjectively than the ticking of the clock or the crossing of days off a calendar would suggest, and that we live it kind of, not necessarily in chronological ways. Our experience and our awareness jumps around in time, and time stretches out on us in some moments and then compresses and races by in others. And that was an idea that had an influence on Faulkner. So again, the Benji character, and you'll see this in Quentin too. You'll see this in the much more, highly educated, kind of intellectual, sophisticated brother who's going to narrate the next section. These characters gave Faulkner an opportunity to take us deeper into that really subjective way of experiencing time. And then I think in Benji's case, he pushes this even further, where temporality just isn't a tool that Benji's really got to make sense of reality, which is why I actually hesitated at saying Benji remembers things. I mean, if I remember something, I sort of put it on a different level than my present experience, and I'm kind of making a hierarchy of things, where the reality of my life is being lived out in the present, and then I go visit other times and other places. And I think for Benji, you could say that all of these different moments of his life that he re-experiences kind of all exist on a level plane. One isn't really any more real or immediate than any other one is. So these are ways of doubling down on that theme of unpreparedness that I was talking about, but they're also ways of exploring those more modern ideas about time, and then kind of what their implications should be for storytelling. how to do aesthetic justice to them. If you want to write a novel that's going to be honest, going to be true to experience.
You sound a lot like Eudora Welty there, Jay. My best compliment.
That-
David.
I'm curious to what extent Faulkner kind of thought about this new course, new way of writing that he was doing with this book, and like, did he like think about it, plan it, plot it? Here's how I'm going to do it, or did by kind of freeing himself up to write a book just for himself, did he sit down and kind of Faulkner the writer came out?
There was some planning in particular that went into the Benji section about how to manage the time levels. So we still have in Faulkner's papers some sheets where he took notes or he made little outlines where he's breaking down all of the different stages in Benji's life, between 1928, right, the present time of section 1, and then 1898, the things that he remembered from 30 years ago, and all kind of points in between. So Faulkner actually sort of sussed that out and made some notes for himself. And so gave himself kind of a skeleton or a framework that he could hang this material around.
Jenny? We're not hearing you, Jenny. You're muted.
This is the first time that I read the book. And when I first started, I was like, what's going on here? And then I just paused and I went really, really slow. And I thought it was beautiful. I mean, I haven't finished it yet. I've just done the first section, but it just hit me how relationships are formed and the hit and miss quality of it. And sometimes I would think, well, doesn't that person remember such and such? But then I get caught up in this time warp kind of myself. And I think it, like you had kind of made a comment in the beginning about, the human mind in terms of just going down deep. And it was like he was mining the mind from this very almost primordial state. And then it blossoms in different ways depending on how the relationships forms. And like I say, I've only done the first section, so I'm not sure how that's all going to play itself out, but it's really been so far really beautiful. For me, a beautiful read. I just, the care that he took, I feel that when I'm reading it.
That makes me really happy to hear that.
I've often think it's as if you're part of Benji, and there's no other way you could experience this as fully. The character.
I do think there's a challenge of reading section 1 in particular on 2 levels, and the first level is just feeling it. Just let yourself feel it. It's unbelievably feelingful and moving. I mean, moving from great distress, I think, and then at other times to great fondness and real love, when he's around his sister, and the kind of beautiful, simple, almost the spontaneous poetry in which Benji can express that love. So when you don't have the same sense-making resources, say that, that functional adult minds have, sometimes you improvise. And so, you break out into a kind of spontaneous poetry. So you're reading to feel on one level, and then I think you're letting understanding come to you gradually, and it will come to you gradually. And I should say, as disorienting as all of the fragmentation going on with time can be, and then sometimes how private Benji's frame of reference can be, so he's not giving you context for anything. The weird thing is that Faulkner is actually also giving you little details that can help you. That can help you get your bearings, and it starts off with the way that the typeface changes whenever a time level seems to change. And then it will move on to, other little clues that can help you get your bearings, like pay attention to which person in the Gibson family has been appointed to be Benji's caretaker, because scenes in which Versh is the main, child hanging out with Benji are the earliest in his narrative. And then scenes with TP, who's Versh's younger brother, are kind of in the middle part of Benji's life. And then the scenes with Luster, like in the real time moment in 1928, Luster is Dilsey's grandson. And so those are the most recent scenes. And so they're just little ways. Is Caddy there in the scene? Is Caddy not there? When Caddy's there, that's the earlier half of the action. And then when she's not there, we're going to learn that eventually she leaves the family, she leaves the household, and that's later stuff. So strangely, Faulkner is giving you a little bit back, with the right hand of what the left hand is taking away from you.
Ray. I think Rita was Rita's next. Okay, good.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Watson. You've already given me something to think about. But in the chapter, I couldn't get the character of Benji. Just couldn't make sense about it. And then I began to see him as a baby. And he's around the age 2 to 3 by his speech. And like a baby, if the baby doesn't get what they want or they get threatened, they're going to howl. And that's what he does. But he's also abnormally knowing in a behavioral way or an emotional way. And he knows that somebody's going to die, for example. And he is said to be a conjurer. So he seems to have these special abilities, kind of like an idiot savant might have. They're deficient in many ways, and in this one way, they're exceptional. So I wonder how you explain his special powers. Are they real somehow, or are they magical? So I put that question to you.
Well, I think, one way to think about disability is to reflect on the ways in which it might involve or might foster different abilities, so that we could think of the disabled as the differently abled. And I think to some extent that's true of Benji with his impairment. So cognitively, Benji seems to be underdeveloped. And yet I think, and you're putting your finger on the fact that he has a tremendous amount of emotional intelligence. He can't necessarily put it into words. He can't articulate it very well, but he tends to be, a very trustworthy emotional touchstone in the presence of other people. So the ones who make him feel good tend to be characters that we can trust more, right? And the ones that elicit all of these negative reactions or make him holler or make him cry tend to be ones we're suspicious of. And then, when we see what happens in the absence of Caddy and his incredible, emotional response to that, we get a sense of her value as a character. And he's also really, really sensitized to change. And that seems to extend all the way to the point where characters die. And he seems tuned into that. And whether that's a kind of paranormal ability or whether it is just an extreme attunement to the way things around him change when the family loses somebody, I'm not sure Faulkner necessarily settles that question. I think we could probably think of it either way, as kind of an irrational gift or as an extraordinary attunement to the emotional wavelengths, going around his family and his household.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Rita.
Then after Rita, we have Hope and then Elta, just to put that in.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have a question about Mrs. Thompson. She's very detached. She's, ill. She's taken to her bed. She seems to be a non-participant in her children's lives, just sort of floats in and floats out. And then she reminds me of the mother in Uncle Tom's Cabin. So that's, of course, about 70 years before this book was written. And I'm wondering if Faulkner used the mother in Uncle Tom's Cabin, I think was it Mrs. Shelby, as a template, or was this sort of take to your bed, failing Southern woman a common character in literature? I mean, I'm not as well read as some people in this book club, so in fact, I'm not at all, but just wondering if that is a common repetition in Southern Gothic writing.
I don't know what other people think. I think that's a really suggestive insight. And I don't know if I can find you a smoking gun that would take Faulkner back to Uncle Tom's Cabin specifically, but I do think you're putting your finger on a Southern type, and a kind of weakened, dependent, invalid kind of woman character or mother character that does appear in a good bit of Southern writing. And I think it's kind of a commentary on how Southern culture preferred its white women in particular to be delicate, weaker vessels, ethereal, up on pedestals, and that could do real damage, real harm to real women. So we might summon up a little feeling for Mrs. Compson as well as a product of her society and its attitudes about gender, even though she certainly does not come across as a very likable character in section 1, at least to me. But I think there's a context for who and what she's become, and it's because this world prefers its women, in particular its white women, to be delicate and fragile, and so in a sense she acts the role to the hilt.
Hope?
Hi, yeah. So and this came up a lot earlier about, like the kind of futility of a lot of the characters, like why there's still kind of this like existential dread of, like why are they doing this? And one thing that's kind of helping me read the novel and just kind of like process the information that we're getting and when we're getting it is going back to the title and the monologue that it's from, and putting it in context to that moment in Macbeth and like why he's even giving that speech, which is all about futility and how life is just one thing after another, and how no matter how hard you try to do the right thing or what you think is the right thing, it will somehow end up in death, because eventually death comes for us all. And despite, how hard we try against some things, it just ends up kind of happening. I'm a little bit losing my train of thought, but it was, something that, because it's just tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And he's saying this in response to learning his wife's death. And, for me, it's almost a little bit of foreshadowing, like why in particular this line, other than the fact that it's just a really good line. And then, this monologue and like what it means in the context of the show. There's so much Shakespeare to pull from. And so for me, it's like everything in this book is so specific when we learn information, who we're getting it from. And I think Faulkner is maybe giving us a little bit of hint of just how to read the book, but then also to remind us that nothing in life is trivial, even if in the end it does kind of feel trivial. So that's one thing that is helping me, just as someone who is more theater and like Shakespeare geared and has read more of that than I have of Faulkner. So
would y'all like to take a closer look at the speech that the title comes from? I've got it up in a file. I can share my screen if you want to look at it together.
Let's do that. And then Elta and Helen when we come back.
All right. Let me come up here. Can y'all see that?
Yep.
Well, I'll go on and read it aloud and just give everybody a minute to think about the kinds of connections that you want to make. But I also think that the previous speaker is so right that we need to think about the context and, for this speech every bit as much as the actual details of the speech itself. So this is a speech that's coming in Act 5, and it is coming right before the fall of a kingdom. So Macbeth makes this speech before he charges out into a battle that he believes he is destined to win because he's misunderstood a prophecy. Before another 10 minutes of stage time has gone by, his entire kingdom is going to have fallen. And so what he's saying is very much, filled with a kind of foreboding about what's to come. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, brief candle. Maybe you think about Benji's birthday cake here. Out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So this is a man with a kind of omen of the meaninglessness of life and of his life, who's about to march out into a battle that in some ways is going to confirm that outlook. And the other wonderful thing that the previous speaker brought up was also what has happened immediately before Macbeth makes this speech, which is that someone has come on stage and informed him that his wife has just died. And this is, the famous Lady Macbeth, who is the one who is a character whose boldness and ambition is actually greater than Macbeth's own. And she's the one, right, who kind of stirs him up, revs him up to seize the throne. So she has been the woman behind the man in this play, and now she's gone. So this speech is bookended by, on the far end, the collapse of a whole way of life, but on the near end, by the loss of a captivating woman. And I think in some ways this points to what's prompting all of Benji's sound and fury, which is trying to muster up some kind of response to maybe the most profound of all the changes that have happened to him in his life, and that is losing Caddy. All right, all of this change and loss for him seems to kind of boil down into the absence of Caddy. Caddy crystallizes this for him, or symbolizes this for him. And that same relationship between the woman and the way of life was already there in the Shakespeare speech. So I can't draw you a line from Faulkner to Uncle Tom's Cabin, but you can draw about a dozen lines from Faulkner to Macbeth.
How important was Phil Stone in choosing this title, Jay?
I'm not aware Stone had any input into that. I mean, the stories that I've heard about the composition of The Sound and the Fury, Phil Stone was probably Faulkner's best literary friend in Oxford. He was a lawyer. He was a little bit older than Faulkner, and he was somebody who had helped turn Faulkner on to modernist writing. So Faulkner had already been a big fan of the great 19th century novelists, the Dickenses and the Dostoevskys and Joseph Conrad, and Phil Stone turned him on to more modern writing, and in some ways helped create this kind of ambition and experimental daring that Faulkner had that you see in The Sound and the Fury. But the stories I've heard about the writing of the novel are that Faulkner would invite Phil Stone up to his room at night, and he would read him aloud what he had written that day on the manuscript. Faulkner was still living with his parents in a house on the campus of the University of Mississippi, and he had this little room up on the second floor. And Stone would go up there to listen, but it doesn't appear that Stone had a lot of direct input into what Faulkner was reading him. I mean, by this point, I think Faulkner was kind of coming into a sense of himself with great confidence as a writer, and in some ways, Stone had less and less influence on him as he moved forward. So that's my best guess, Suzanne.
I thought I had read
came up with this title on his own.
I thought I had read somewhere that Stone said he suggested it, but I probably made a mistake about that.
Now, Stone was completely capable of suggesting to someone else that he was the source for it. And he did have he sometimes had some kind of overblown ideas about how responsible he was for Faulkner's genius. So that might have been one of those moments.
Yeah, that may be it. Elta, are you still around? I've lost your picture.
Well, I just love this discussion so much, but I'm interested in Benji's obsession with death, with the graveyard, his graveyard that he nurtures in the Jimson weed, and the images of Nancy in the ditch and the bones, and the howling that he does to me is a howl of loss. It's of Caddy, and then this accumulation of losses and death. And I wonder if you would just speak about that.
Well, for me, my takeaway from this is really that these responses to death are just one group of his responses to change. And I'll tell you what convinces me of this is that he responds the same way to Caddy's wedding. And, that's the one event in the long litany of things we could bring up. I mean, he remembers, the night of his grandmother's death, and he remembers the night that they changed his name. And, he remembers this terrible misunderstanding that goes on with the little schoolgirl outside the fence. And he remembers Quentin dying, and he remembers his father dying, and he remembers the dead horse, but he remembers his sister's wedding with the same sorts of howls and bellows at what ought to be a joyous event, right, in the life of the family. So part of what I see here in the responses to death, but really the responses to all of the other examples of profound change in his life, is really an inability to accept change, is an outrage or an anger or a grief almost at any and all change. Right, just including, if he's looking into the fire grate of the stove in the kitchen and then you close the door. So this is a character who's not equipped to be able to embrace change or adapt to change, but is really, really kind of rigidly dug in against it. And we could say this is because because he's a very simple-minded character, or his intelligence is limited, and so he really needs order and pattern in his life. But to some extent, he's not the exception in that regard in his family. He's the rule. He's a window onto many of the Compsons, almost all of the Compsons, in how resistant they are to a world that is changing around them every day. A modern 20th century South.
Helen.
This goes back. This goes back to the bedridden mother. I'm sorry, I can't speak. We were discussing the bedridden mother, and I just wanted to say that is a factor in dysfunctional families, both in literature as well as psychology, especially when the mother, as Shakespeare says, frets and struts daily with her martyrdom, and places a great burden of guilt upon the children. So that I just wanted to add that belatedly to that discussion.
And I think we see the pressure that puts on Caddy. It's not anything Benji ever stops to address. Benji, in a sense, takes it for granted that Caddy will be there for him, and Caddy will make him the center of her life, because really all he's ever known is Caddy stepping in, right, to the role that Mrs. Compson is, for the most part, abdicating. She's the only girl child, right? She's the only daughter. So, of course, it's going to fall to her, if anybody, well, her and Dilsey, right, to supply a lot of that caring and nurturing and structure that the mother is not really providing for her children. This is a hard thing to ask a girl and then a young woman to do, especially as Caddy reaches adolescence and becomes more interested in a life beyond the family and a life beyond the home place. in ways that involve, sexual exploration and discovery, but lots of other kinds of moving outward to embrace the mystery and the variety of life. And that, is directly at odds with her ability to subordinate herself to the needs of her brothers, right? Benji at the head of the
And
line.
her mother takes that as a personal burden upon her. Anything that Caddy does
Mhm.
is seen as she's doing it to persecute the mother.
Mm-hmm. That's right. It's all about her.
Mhm.
But in a sense, it's all about Benji, right? In a very similar way, it's all about Benji. And so maybe, there wind up being a lot of continuities there. And we are learning something about family dysfunction that, in some ways, the mother's failings, and I'm not talking about, genetic failings here or congenital failings, but
Right.
the mother's caregiving failings produce like another character, a son who is as self-absorbed as she is. Maybe more forgivably so, but nonetheless.
But she flaunts it. It is, as an actor on the stage, she is flaunting all of this is from her children.
All right, let's go Joe Ellen and then Ray. Joe Ellen.
Thanks, Jay, for all of your help here. Could we turn quickly to some narrative devices? Like you mentioned, not being able to quite say Benji remembers something, but we're thinking of him as remembering this a kind of stream of consciousness thing. And I really don't know what the critical conversations have been around, let's say, the thing that just sticks like a craw in my gullet is him remembering his father's Latin and making a joke. If we translate the Latin, we even can understand the joke that Mr. Compson is making with his son. And how does that fit in the whole process of things? That seems at best, if you call the stream of consciousness, that we have a lapse into a kind of free and direct discourse here where the narrator is popping in. But how do you see that?
You're talking about Quentin, aren't you? Not
No,
Benji.
I'm talking about, isn't it in the Benji section?
Yeah.
That we get the Latin.
At Ego in Arcadia, I have
Hmm.
forgotten the word for mule,
Mhm.
right? Yeah.
Right.
I'm not finding the page number, but I think that is in the first section. So one way to address this in a super oversimplified way, Joe Allen, is that Faulkner has made Benji something like a video recorder.
Yeah.
That sort of, there's a minimum of mind there processing and interpreting the kind of raw perception, that goes in. There is an interpreting presence. You can see it when Benji howls and bellows and, reacts with outrage to things. But a lot of the times Benji is recording and I almost mean that literally, recording what's going on around him. And, Faulkner has just asked us to trust the fact that he records this with great fidelity.
Has Benji ever been been discussed as a kind of idiot savant?
Yes. And we've already had one comment, to that, to that effect. So
Our next speaker is the one who brought it up. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So, you could say that's right. This is an extraordinary gift he has. So he doesn't necessarily think about what he is seeing and hearing, but he records it. And so it makes its way onto the page. Whoever's responsible for that transition, Benji can't write, right? So whoever that sort of narrator type figure is, who's responsible for kind of transcribing Benji onto the page, I think when he reports that somebody said something, it's quite trustworthy, that we can probably assume that person said it and said it pretty much the way that it was quoted. And when he, reports seeing something, it was probably there. This is not a character that we would necessarily think, is hallucinating anything of what he's saying. Right. So I'm trying to think of how to describe this. You're going to see something more like a stream of consciousness when you move into section 2 and you follow and listen to Quentin. With Benji, the contents of his consciousness are so jagged and so fragmented that we might want to use the term stream of consciousness because they do seem to be different to our more kind of linear common sense way of thinking about what we're experiencing. I think of Benji more as a storm of consciousness, really, than a stream of consciousness. But I think it's there, and I think it happened. I mean, I think when he tells you something happened, it happened. So that's the strange thing is how reliable a narrator Benji is in that respect. He can't necessarily tell you the meaning of what you're seeing and hearing, but he can give you the raw material. And I think you can trust it.
Thanks.
Ray. You're muted, Ray.
Thank you for that comment, Dr. Watson. I'll have the pleasure of telling my wife that she was right about that. That was her impression as well. I wanted to bring up for your opinion what you think about the family. And the more that I read about it in the Benji section, the more it seemed a dystopia. And all the characters have flaws, like promiscuity, for example, lying, for example, which Caddy did, gluttony, perhaps, with Jason. He's a miser, a money grubber. And then Quentin suicides. So these children are in a place that I found more and more oppressive. And then at the end of it, and the chief person is Benji. And this is a person who no longer has a mother. And there's a huge contact between mother and baby, or sometimes father and baby. So, and there has to be terror that Benji doesn't get his needs met anymore. So, and then we have the parents who have abandoned the family, and Dilsey keeps order, but she doesn't give a lot of hugs. So how do you react to this view of the family?
Well, I think this is absolutely a case study in a dysfunctional family. I mean, I think you can just start without even kind of thinking beyond the family to, you know, to its time and place. This is kind of how not to be a family, circa 1928. And it's interesting because, you know, during this period in the teens and 20s, I mean, overlapping with a lot of the Compson history and the Compson story, there was all this sociological literature and kind of, you know, criminological literature about dysfunctional families and, you know, the warping effects that they have on the next generation and, you know, the need for eugenic measures to kind of keep dysfunctional families from reproducing themselves. And those narratives were almost always about kind of working class or poor families. And Faulkner is giving us one about a family that had every privilege, right? I mean, and, you know, an elite family in a very hierarchical society. And it has also reached this kind of, you know, this apex of dysfunction by the 20th century. And that's maybe where your dystopia comes in, because Faulkner has given the Compsons a world and a history that in the 19th century, you know, would have considered itself utopian. This kind of, you know, old Southern world of white privilege and wealth and power that the South liked to kind of broadcast out to the rest of the world in order to advertise the legitimacy of its civilization, even a civilization you could found on slavery. And yet by the 20th century, you know, what had once fancied itself as a utopian society in America has become this deeply dystopian place. And I think that's where the Compsons are a window onto the 20th century white South.
I've been thinking about Pound's poem, Hugh Selwyn Moberly, where he says, talking about the war, there died a myriad of them for an old bitch gone in the teeth for a botched civilization.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost as if the Compsons are the emblem of that botched civilization.
And I do very much think it's a Southern civilization. You know, I
Yeah.
mean, pound didn't mean the South, but
Right.
Faulkner does. And I'll give you one, I'll walk the walk here. I'll give you one bit of evidence for that. Beyond the superficial, you know, Southernness of the family, I think one of the most terrible things that Mrs. Compson does to Benji is she changes his name. You know, she takes the name away that would have linked him to the rest of the family because it was, you know, intended to honor her brother, right, Uncle Maury. And apparently by the time Benji is about 5 years old, you know, his condition is too embarrassing and too stigmatizing to allow him to keep that name that would link him with his uncle, right? So they change his name to the biblical name. And, you know, the biblical Benjamin was a baby brother, right? A lot like this one. Some of you guys are probably far more knowledgeable on the subject than I am. The biblical Benjamin was threatened with enslavement in Egypt. And I think there are ways in which you can compare Benji's predicament around the Compson place with a kind of enslavement and confinement, incarceration. There are a lot of ways in which Benji's experience gets kind of racialized. And the taking away of his birth name and the giving him another name is another example of that. But in my Oxford annotated Bible, one of the translations that's given for the name Benjamin is son of the South. Son of the South. And I think Faulkner knew his Bible. In particular, he knew the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. I think Faulkner would have been in a position to know this and to realize what he was suggesting in having this character named, right, son of the South, as though suggesting that Benji is a kind of representative figure, that we should see him as a window onto the larger culture around him. And if that's true, the disability, the dysfunction, the kind of arrested development, the backward-looking orientation, where Benji spends probably more time in section 1 telling you about things that happened in the past than he does telling you about things that happened on April 7th. All of these are ways, I think, that Faulkner is really, you know, he's giving us a clue that, you know, that the Benji character is a way to explore something about the turn of the century South. And in particular, it's, you know, its difficulties dealing with the coming of a more modern world.
Amen, brother. Harriet and then Liz.
And I just want to check with Dr. Watson. I know it's 12:59, just to make sure we're okay going a little bit over. Okay, great.
Last two, Harriet and Liz.
Yeah, so I was going to say, wanting to get to the cultural ideas for a while, I think, you know, that something we need to talk about as we go forward too is our Southern ideas about gender and the way they're written into Mrs. Compson. The idea I'm thinking about the ways in which ideas about Southern purity are written on the bodies of women and white women in particular, and the ways in which a class and caste system is behind Mrs. Compson, Caddy, Quinty, the young Quinton, all the three women in the family who we see, and just something to and at the same time ideas about masculinity and honor and protection, and the insistence on purity, and just putting those out as things to talk about as we move forward.
You're setting the stage beautifully for next week when you guys dive into section 2. The thing I'll say about these kind of cultural issues is that in a way we have to apply them from the outside to what we're reading in section 1. These are not things that Benji is going to stop and contemplate, right? Or ponder. Benji doesn't know he's a son of the South. But as you move forward, you know, you're going to meet characters who do know that they're sons of the South. And so, yeah, the way that their regional society thinks about gender and race are going to deeply influence, you know, their sense of their self, their sense of their own selves, and then their responsibilities in the family and the other people around them in the family. So amen, sister.
And Liz, you have the last word. Or the next to the last word. You're muted, Liz.
There, can you hear me?
Now we can.
I will save mine till next week. How about that?
No.
Okay, just very quickly. I have just spent 10 minutes going through my notes. I took this class with Pearl McCaney, the Son and the Fury. And at some point, I cannot find it in the book, there was mention that the children became sick, became ill. And at that point, there was a change in Benji, and we discussed, did these kids have the measles or not? And I cannot find it in the book. Are you aware of this?
Mm-hmm.
And I will look for it again.
They have the measles in their own, they have a special
Uh-huh.
room for when they're
Yeah.
sick.
And so that this may account for Benji's disability, that he had the measles at a very young age, 18 months, 2 years, whatever. And at that point, he then became, mentally disabled. So I found that very interesting because it's just sort of a quick sentence about that.
If y'all have the Vintage International
We
edition
do.
paperback, this is an old cover, but it's you might have a newer cover. It's on page 38. It is in the Benji section. And this is when the children are kind of arguing amongst themselves about what's going on up at the house, like whether it's a funeral or whether it's a party. And you can hear Caddy trying to lord it over the Gibson children with all of the authority of white knowledge. And of course, it's Dilsey's kids who know what time it is, right? They know what's really going on. So they have this little discussion about the room upstairs, and Caddy says that's where Damity is. She's sick every day now. When she gets well, we're going to have a picnic. And Frony says, I knows what I knows, right? She's not getting well. The trees were buzzing in the grass. And then Caddy says, the room next to it is where we have the measles. Where do you and TP have the measles, Frony? And Frony says, has them just wherever we is, I reckon. Right? Like they don't get to have a special room or, where the sick children go. So it's just telling you so much about the difference between these worlds, but also, the different kinds of authority that what Black people know have from what white people know and how they know.
And I hope another thing we're going to discuss more fully is the relationship of the Black family, the Gibsons, to the Compsons, the comparison of.
If you wanted to make little family trees for the two of them, you would see that they look pretty similar. So that in some ways, Faulkner is giving us the Gibsons as a foil, almost kind of character by character for the Compsons. But y'all figure all this out next week, and I'll look forward to learning from you.
Jay, thank you so much. This has been great. We really appreciate it. See you next week. See Jay in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.